In spite of the unified effort across the globe to combat the Beta invasion, the nations of Earth were still locked in a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. When Eurasia found itself suffering the immediate effects of war against the alien threat, it was the US who gained a significant upper hand over its political rivals. The tactical surface fighter, an American innovation, became indicative of the world's reliance upon America for survival. For the Soviet government, this reality was both unavoidable and undesirable. Efforts were soon taken to ensure a separation from Western influence, fostering designs that could be wholly original to the USSR, no matter what it took. The Soviet Army initially relied upon a variant of the F-4 Phantom, the F-4R. And dissatisfied as they were about relying on American technology, their engineers quickly studied the design of the F-4. Before long, designs for a brand new, entirely Soviet-built TSF were underway. For the USSR, this, they claimed, would be the MiG-21 Balalaika. In reality, the MiG-21 was a completely refurbished F-4 Phantom, rebuilt to the specifications and requirements of the Soviet military and its battle doctrines. The Phantom was heavily armored and ideal for long-range bombardments. Utilizing it as a base, Soviet engineers redesigned the frame so as to reduce weight and simplify armor on the shoulder block and leg components, making it much more capable in close-range combat. The Balalaika, as a result, became a craft of its own, even in spite of its lack of true originality. Designed by the defense manufacturer Mikoyan Gulevich, the MiG-21 was first deployed in 1975. It is powered by two K-25-300 jump unit engines, the design of which had been streamlined from the F-4s to provide added mobility in close quarters. Primarily, the Balalaika makes use of the WS-16 assault cannon in combat, as well as the CIWS-1A close combat knife, stored within the sheaths in front of its elbow joints. Over time, various weapon systems from across the Eastern Bloc would also be implemented into the Balalaika's arsenal, such as the Chinese Type 77 halberd, or the East German DS-3 supplemental armor. The DS-3, also referred to as the Schürzen, was often covered in explosive reactive armor. While serving a lethal purpose for defending against Beta at close range, surface pilots often used the reactive armor offensively as well. The charges could be remotely detonated by the pilot, allowing them to face their shield toward the enemy and unleash an explosive volley of shrapnel. The DS-3 also featured bladed edges on its lower end, increasing its versatility as a close combat weapon. Skilled East German pilots were also capable of running the point of the DS-3 into the ground at high speeds in order to force a sudden pivot in their craft's trajectory. Such a technique further showcased the maneuverability of the MiG-21 and expanded upon its usability across the many fronts over which the Eastern Bloc contended. Soviet territory was vast, with a variety of terrain and climates, from polar regions to deserts and temperate zones. Standard operating procedures among Soviet Army surface pilots often saw a single TSF being shared between multiple pilots, each rotating between shifts while the TSF would sortie on a continual basis. Thus, sustained operability under all conditions and simplifications to frontline maintenance were key to the MiG-21's design principles. The downgraded armor of the MiG-21 simplified these maintenance demands, allowing for extensive use across all manner of environments. Like many TSFs deployed to the front lines of Eurasia, the F-4R had been forced into close combat far more than intended. Despite the lack of armor, Additional features to the MiG-21 gave it increased survivability under such circumstances. The head module of the F-4 was trimmed in size, resulting in a slimmer design. A wire cutter was added to the front of the MiG-21's head for protection, and only a single, upright sensor mast was attached to the component's rear. The reductions in weight and removal of excess bulk further added to its dogfighting potential. Because of its origin, the MiG-21 remained compatible with the same production lines as the F-4, allowing the Soviet Union to quickly license its production across member nations of the Warsaw Treaty Organization. The Balalaika soon saw widespread adoption across the Eastern Bloc, eventually replacing the local Phantom variants entirely. By the early half of the 1980s, the craft produced in East Germany were noted to be of exceptionally high quality, being distributed to surrounding nations in large numbers, as well as, quite notably, being reverse supplied to the Soviet Union itself. As a first-generation TSF, the Balalaika performs nominally against the Beta during head-on engagements. Though, like the F-4, even with high casualty rates, the MiG-21 was pivotal for Warsaw forces in many battles during the 70s and 80s. Most notable of the MiG-21's feats was during Operation Paleologos in 1978, when members of the Soviet 43rd Guards Division infiltrated the Minsk Hive and advanced underground for a grueling 3.5 hours. The Volk Regiment, operating MiG-21s, were first to break through into the stab, fighting countless Beta in order to acquire valuable data on the structural layout of the alien hives and the subterranean movement patterns of Beta forces. Following an enemy counterattack, the entire infiltration force was annihilated, and only 14 pilots of the Volk Regiment survived, having returned beforehand with the battle data intact. In the following years, the MiG-21 would continue to see extensive use, especially in the other nations of the Warsaw Pact. Many variants exist between them, as the Balalaika demonstrated a great deal of configurable versatility. Echoing its origin from the F-4, the MiG-21 would itself become the progenitor of the Chinese J-8, a localized variant which swapped out the head module for a distinctly rounded and armored Chinese design. Another variant, proven highly effective, was the command model developed by East Germany, the MiG-21PF. It featured a forward-mounted sensor mast, capable of overpowering comm interference under heavy metal cloud conditions. Possessing such capabilities rendered it purpose-built for laser-Jagd operations, which would become the key philosophy behind TSF combat doctrine in the years to come. Outside of the Volk Regiment, the most notable unit to employ the MiG-21 would be the National Volksarmee's 666th Tactical Armor Squadron, the Schwarzes Marken of East Germany. In combat, their primary mission was the laser-Jagd, conducting search and destroy sorties deep into the heart of Beta herds, advancing on the Oder-Neisse defense line in order to eliminate laser-class Beta. Despite piloting outdated machines, the Ace Squadron demonstrated their efficiency at this role, even managing to keep pace with the more advanced F-14 Tomcat during culling operations in Gdansk, Poland. The Schwarzes Marken would go on to utilize the Balalaika in anti-TSF combat as well, demonstrating moderate success against the MiG-23 Chubarashka. Their expertise in TSF piloting was pivotal in fighting against the Stasi and liberating the German people from oppression. This would be one unspoken piece out of many comprising the legacy of the MiG-21. Inspired by the F-5 Freedom Fighter, the MiG-23 Chubarashka succeeded in becoming the Soviet Union's first domestically developed tactical surface fighter. It was a lightweight craft built for close-range engagements, incorporating ambitious design technology in an effort to achieve next-generation status. Unlike the MiG-21, it is not a refurbishment. While trace design elements of the F-4 and F-5 are present in its appearance, every single component is produced by the Soviet Union. Deployed by the Soviet Army in 1980, the MiG-23 was developed by Mikhail Gulovich. It utilizes two K-35-300 jump unit engines. These are designed with an innovative variable wing feature, which allowed for increased control and maneuverability of the TSF. This feature itself was inspired by Western technology, particularly that of Grunin's F-14 Tomcat and Palavia Industrial's F-5E Tornado. Because of the advanced design, many in the Eastern Bloc consider the Chubarashka to be a quasi-second-generation machine, surpassing many in the West, despite official designations listing it as first generation. In combat, the MiG-23 makes use of the WS-16 assault cannon, standard issue across the world at the time. As well, its knife sheaths carry the CIWS-1A close combat knife, and a vertical wire cutter was installed directly in front of the head module sensors to protect its optics during close combat. Like the MiG-21, its arsenal varied based on the decade and location of its use, as the Chubarashka was noted to utilize the DS-3 supplemental armor when under the employ of East Germany. Having borrowed primarily from the lightweight features of the MiG-21 and F-5, the MiG-23 was purpose-built for close combat and highly mobile engagements. On paper, it was a marked success in technical achievement, noted for surpassing the Balalaika in its combat role. The Chubarashka's rollout was highly celebrated as well, demonstrating an official breakaway from alliance on the West. In reality, the advanced, variable wing design, which had been trending by Western manufacturers at the time, proved far more logistically demanding for the Soviet Union to uphold. Qualified personnel, a supply of available parts, proper facilities, and ease of maintenance were factors which severely reduced the operational ability of the MiG-23. The Soviet Army was only organized enough so that the cheaper and quicker maintenance of the MiG-21 could be performed on a constant basis without issue, whereas the MiG-23 often occupied Soviet hangars for undesirably long periods of time. Because it was the poster child of Soviet TSF innovation, the Soviet Army could not speak derisively of the MiG-23. Despite this, the craft was given the name Chubarashka by the troops, naming it after a children's television character noted for retaining a slow and clumsy personality. Eventually, the Soviet Armed Forces HQ realized the incompatible nature of the MiG-23 and recalled the machine from the front for the sake of installing more adequate refurbishments. Orders for proper facilities and supply systems were heavily increased, and Mikhail Gulovich sought ways to simplify the frontline maintenance procedures. Even in spite of its logistical shortcomings, the reputational value of the TSF was leveraged to the advantage of the party. Allies and client states across Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe who desired stronger ties with the Soviet Union would be given cheap access to the MiG-23. Thus, exports of the craft proceeded with great effect even with its failures to meet battlefield expectations. Meanwhile, the Soviets, taking their accumulated lessons, set out to redesign the Chubarashka instead, leading to the MiG-27 Alligatori. Even though the Soviet Union was unable to sustain the logistical demands required of the MiG-23, exports to East Germany were found to be extremely compatible with the National Volksarmee. The German Democratic Republic had no shortage of skilled engineers and technological know-how, and so the proper facilities and procedures for maintaining advanced craft were readily available. In their hands, the MiG-23 was an enviable craft for NVA surface pilots, and the latent potential of the Chubaraschka was constantly demonstrated on the battlefield, even after its use became more and more restricted to the Stasi forces. Consequently, the most notable variation of this TSF were the MiG-23s utilized by the German Democratic Republic's Ministry of State Security. Painted in a customary dark green pattern, they were no different than the base model TSF. However, by reputation, their pilots were skilled, and on multiple occasions, the Chubaraschka was used to shoot down fleeing or rebellious surface pilots of the National Volksarmee. The Stasi variation soon became an infamous symbol of the much-hated socialist ministry. From among the Stasi, the deadliest unit to employ the MiG-23 was the 101st Werewolf Battalion. Tasked with enforcing state security on the front lines, they were known for their ruthlessness in prosecuting anti-government dissidents. The Werewolf Battalion conducted sorties in support of the National Volksarmee on multiple occasions, yet they answered to a separate chain of command. It is highly evident during one engagement that the battalion deliberately withheld their forces in order to effect losses among NVA troops capable of threatening them militarily. The Werewolf Battalion fought against rebelling NVA forces led by General Franz Heim. While fighting along the Havel River, they met with initial success against the Volksarmee surface pilots, though heavy losses were sustained due to combined armed tactics from the rebel troops. Over the skies of Berlin itself, all remaining members of the Werewolf Battalion were shot down and eliminated. Developed as a response to the unpopularity of the MiG-23, the MiG-27 Alligatori was initially conceived of as yet another upgrade to the first-generation Chubaraschka. In that regard, the mistakes of its progenitor craft have been rectified in full. Yet with 90% of its component parts being completely different from the MiG-23, the Alligatori became a machine of its own, entirely built to second-generation standards. Under orders of the Soviet government, the MiG-27 was designed by Mikoyan Gulevich in an attempt to mitigate perceptions of their technological inferiority. It was officially deployed in 1983 and would remain in service even up through the year 2001. As with the MiG-23, the MiG-27 relies upon the K-35 300 jump unit engines. In combat, the Alligatori uses the WS-16 assault cannon for long-range engagements. In a symbolic departure from reliance on Western weapons technology, the MiG-27 features a close combat dagger of Soviet design. The Sea-Whiz-1E was a combat knife which utilized a longer blade, necessitating larger knife sheaths for the MiG-27. The newly designed forearm components were one of the more distinctive differences between the Chubaraschka and the Alligatori. For defensive purposes, the DS-3 supplemental armor was also compatible with the craft. Like the Chubaraschka, the Alligatori was designed for high mobility and close-quarters combat. Unlike its predecessor, the maintainability and operative time of the TSF was improved, and its performance in combat was superior to the MiG-23. Another visual difference between the craft was the enlarged sensor mass of the MiG-27's head unit, as well as a more streamlined and efficient design to the head itself. This allowed for increased communication and signal strength under battlefield conditions, where heavy metal cloud interference would be in effect. In developing the MiG-27, Mikoyan Gulevich operated under the expectation that their TSF would differentiate itself from the much criticized MiG-23. Ironically, the manufacturers publicly noted the successes of the MiG-23 in the service of East Germany, where a firmly built logistics framework could support the craft. This was an unintentional slight against the Soviet Union, as it demonstrated the inadequacy of their own personnel and maintenance facilities in comparison to their client states. As well, hoping to ensure the Alligatory did not suffer the same reputational mistakes of the Chubarashka, Mikoyan Gulovich conducted numerous combat trials before the official deployment of the MiG-27. Advanced models were sent to the East German military for frontline testing, and the many entirely new components assured an improvement in quality. When the MiG-27 was finally delivered to the Soviet armed forces, it was a resounding success compared to their last design. With further improvements to logistics and personnel experience, the Alligatory was fully sustained for consistent operations along the front. The stigma of its predecessor had for the most part been removed, and frontline service pilots appropriately praised the MiG-27. It was a reliable second-generation machine that represented the growing experience of Soviet manufacturers when it came to TSF design. Unfortunately for the craft, Mikoyan Gulovich's extensive process of quality assurance meant that it was delivered to the Soviet military long after the United States had introduced the far more advanced F-14 Tomcat. Even being a second-generation TSF, the Alligatory was completely outdated in comparison, as it had been built upon the framework of the first-generation MiG-23, whereas the F-14 was an entirely original machine of its own, capable of much more on the battlefield. This was yet again another slight against the Soviet Union, who would regard the MiG-27 less favorably for not delivering a victory in the realm of propaganda. Despite this, the Alligatory and even the Chubarashka would continue to prove their reliability, even as the decades would introduce more advanced TSFs. The two machines would still comprise approximately 40% of all TSF forces across the Soviet Union in the year 2000. A known variant of the Alligatory would be the advanced model delivered to the GDR Ministry of State Security's Werewolf Battalion. One machine in particular was painted in a distinct signature red camouflage pattern, piloted by the battalion commander. While other MiG-27s saw service in East Germany, its status as the Eastern Bloc's most advanced TSF in the early 80s meant that its use was kept almost exclusively to the Stasi. The 101st Werewolf Tactical Armor Battalion would be the most notable unit to use the MiG-27, though only in limited numbers. Major Beatrix Brem would pilot the Alligatory and participate in the fighting against the Beta at Fort Zilo. In late March of 1983, Brem was shot down and killed over the skies of Berlin during a dogfight with rebel TSFs. A custom MiG-23 was responsible for scoring the kill. In light of the ever-increasing technological prowess of NATO and the United States, the Soviet Union continually dedicated their researchers and engineers to replicating the successes of their rivals. The MiG-25 Spirit Vaz was born out of an early attempt to implement the concept of a high-low mix into the Soviet military's TSF arsenal. It was a long-range craft built to conduct high-speed assaults and rely primarily on bombardments. Manufactured by Mikoyan Gulovich, the MiG-25 would see its deployment in the year 1987. It was powered by two K-15BD 300 jump unit engines, which were enhanced in order to produce a massive amount of thrust for the rather sizable machine. Not much is known about the specific armaments of the MiG-25, though it would be reasonable to assume it was capable of using the standard assault cannon of its time. As well, it was known that two specifically designed attachments of supplemental armor were equipped on each of the craft's forearm components. These were capable of a variety of functions, likely including offense and defense. As the MiG-25's design took little consideration for close combat, these capabilities were not to any phenomenal degree. Most notable about the MiG-25's armament was its capacity for carrying an undisclosed amount of nuclear ordnance. The method of delivery is not recorded in any format. However, the TSF was capable of bombarding enemy positions with guided warheads. In theory, it was believed that nuclear strikes would allow TSFs to brute force their way into a beta hive, cutting through the underground stab and allowing their high-speed machines to reach the hive reactor within record time. Hive capture would then be achieved by bombarding the reactor itself with all nuclear ordnance available. In truth, the MiG-25 was born out of a Soviet attempt to recreate the design philosophy of the McDonnell-Douglas F-15 Eagle under the context of their own specifications. At the time, the MiG-25 was undergoing development within the advanced MFPTI design program, where it was known as the YE-155. Due to a lack of technological infrastructure caused by continual losses of ground to the beta, the program was in the midst of severe setbacks. Thus, the Communist Party secretly acquired the salvaged wrecks of any F-15s which had been downed in the employ of Allied nations. Based on studies conducted on the Eagle remains, the YE-155 was redesigned under the context of what the Eagle was believed to be capable of, while maintaining the specifications required by the Soviet Union. In the end, its combat role greatly differed from the F-15, which was meant to provide medium to close-range bombardment rather than specializing in hive capture. The frame of the TSF was enlarged by 20% in comparison to the Eagle, and an emphasis was placed on durability and engine output. Mobility and dogfighting capabilities were not considered, as the primary intent for the craft was to use nuclear warhead bombardments to achieve breakthroughs of enemy lines. Once development completed, it was designated as the MiG-25 and was soon assigned to units at the front lines. During its first sortie against the Beta, it earned the name Spirit Vaz from the Soviet troops due to the suicidal nature of its design. A Russian commander was forced to relinquish a considerable amount of vodka in order to convince surface pilots under his command to board the machine and conduct the intended nuclear attacks into the enemy. The MiG-25 continually performed its mission with an extremely low survival rate, leading to the myth that its name exists because only a drunken surface pilot would ever consider piloting the craft in combat. As well, it was often derisively called the SS-25, a nickname deriving from the SS-24 ICBM. While upgrades to the machine would eventually lead to the MiG-31, there were no official variations to the MiG-25. As well, no notable units were recorded as piloting the MiG-25 in combat. A large, heavyweight TSF designed for close-quarters combat, the Su-27 Zhuravlik fulfilled the high role within the high-low mix of the Soviet military. It is a second-generation craft which, in spite of its size, excelled in mobility and made use of innovative designs in armament. It would go on to set a precedent for Soviet TSF design in the years following its introduction. The Su-27 was developed by Sufoni, a rival manufacturer of Mikoyan Gulevich. It deployed in 1992 and stands at an impressive height at just over 19 meters tall. The Zhuravlik utilizes two ALS-31 jump unit engines, in which refurbishments featured the addition of four wing-shaped blades along the side of its inlet. These would significantly boost the craft's maneuverability, and combined with its high engine output, the Su-27 would more than meet its ambitious design specifications. In combat, the Zhuravlik makes use of the Soviet-manufactured assault cannon, the A-97, to provide short to medium-range bombardment. The gun itself was a simplified redesign of the WS-16C, being one of many signifiers for the craft's distinct identifiers as a Soviet machine. Another novel feature was the incorporation of blade vanes, most notably attached to the Su-27's shoulder blocks and head unit, while the lower legs consisted of sharpened frontal edges. These would afford the craft a degree of protection in the dense, close-quarters fighting expected of it. Lastly, the Su-27 was first among Soviet TSFs to feature the motor blade, an entirely original TSF armament. Hive capture was critical to Soviet strategic doctrine, as the USSR fully intended to reclaim all of its lost territory. The motor blade provided the Zhuravlik with a dogfighting edge. Combined with its maneuverability, it would prove highly effective against the Beta in melee combat, making it ideal for engagements within the underground stab. Yet for all of its physical and technological accomplishments, the Su-27 was also designed around the data of American TSFs. Initially, when the USSR was selected by the UN to host the Alternative 3 program, it was observed that Soviet TSFs of the time were wholly inadequate to meet the requirements of the program. Controversially, a variant of the F-14, the F-14AN, was selected as a craft to be utilized by Alternative 3. Sofony was given the responsibility of maintaining and operating the F-14AN, in which it developed ties to the Grunin Corporation, lending insight into the features of the F-14 itself. On the American end, Grunin had recently not been selected for the ATSF competition. In the midst of financial straits, they offered the Soviets clandestine information regarding the F-14 Tomcat. These factors would influence the development of the Su-27, evidenced by the size of the craft and the components such as the chest block or feet, bearing a striking visual similarity to the F-14s. As well, the USSR had been struggling to design an advanced TSF, and while they ordered Mikoyan Gulevich to redesign the MiG-23 into a far more optimal craft, they discreetly ordered Sofony to manufacture a superior machine at the same time. Early Sofony prototypes, such as the Su-11 and Su-15, would never reach mass production, but the Su-27 would surpass every one of the MiGs developed thus far. Following its initial rollout, the Zhuravlik received many upgrades and refurbishments to address technical issues caused by its high power requirements. During the course of the 90s, maintenance and logistics within the Soviet military would gradually improve, facilitating a conducive environment for such revisions to its design. Like the earliest F-15 Eagle variant, issues presented by the Su-27 originated from the design being ahead of its time, and it was the development infrastructure itself which needed to improve and keep pace with the TSF's capabilities. These factors allowed Sofony to escape the many pitfalls which befell the MiG lineage outside of combat. This would not deter the MiG's presence on the front lines, however. While the Su-27 was more and more adopted by conventional forces, it still required higher maintenance. The MiG-29 Lastochka and its predecessors remained cheaper to produce overall and were constantly reliable under demanding conditions. The Zhuravlik, then, came to function as the high to the Lastochka's low in the high-low mix. This dynamic was demonstrated during the assault on the Evensk Hive on December 31st of 2001, which culminated in a laser jagd conducted by a squadron of Su-27s, whose assault was supported by multiple units of MiG-29s. Elsewhere during the war, the Su-27 served reliably when applied in force against critical enemy advances. On the Kamchatka Peninsula, it would often be utilized as a quick reaction force when the Beta made landfall, deploying from the rear to shore up any collapsing battle lines. Of the variations to the Su-27, most notable are its upgraded models. Its proof-of-concept third-generation variant was later adopted as the Su-37 Terminator, a more well-known TSF meant largely to answer the early issues faced by the Zhuravlik, while the Terminator would soon become the focus of the USSR's race to design a third-generation machine. The highly refurbished Su-27 model, the Su-27 SM, was still developed and quickly deployed across the front, becoming the modern, heavily utilized craft it was known for. Many of the Soviet Union's European allies received exports of the Zhuravlik. As well, the Chinese Third United Front purchased the license to produce the TSF for their own forces. Western nations also were actively approached with export offers for the Zhuravlik, though it is unknown if any were exchanged. The single most notable unit which utilized the Su-27 was the famous 211th Tsar Battalion. While their commander piloted a Su-37 Terminator, the members of Tsar Battalion made use of the Zhuravlik in combat. The unit served with distinction along the Kamchatka front, where constant beta landfalls led to heavy, often brutal fighting along the peninsula's western shore. When the Evensk Hive had developed enough to begin the deployment of laser strains against collapsing Soviet positions, the Tsar Battalion took it upon themselves to launch a laser jagd into an Army Corps-sized herd of beta, galvanizing the regrouping Soviet forces into action. They successfully eliminated the laser strains present and saved the Kamchatka front. Allegedly, all members of the battalion were killed in action, and were posthumously recognized as heroes of the Soviet Union. There are a number of tactical surface fighters utilized by the Soviet military that we have yet to cover. These will feature in a future video. A huge shout out goes to all supporters and subscribers for your patience and dedication. Many more TSFs exist across the world for us to depict. While content can only remain sporadic for the foreseeable future, none of it has come to a halt, and there will always be information for us to cover. Thank you once again, and see you later.